The aircraft drops out of the cloud base and there it is, dark against the whitecaps, a German U-boat caught on the surface with no room to hide. The crew on deck runs for the hatch. The bow lifts. The stern settles. In seconds, the boat is sliding under, leaving only the swirl, the oil, the last shape of a conning tower being swallowed by the Atlantic. The pilot attacks anyway. Depth charges tumble into the wake. A moment later, the sea punches upward in white columns. Then come the muffled underwater blows, one after another, rolling across the water like doors being slammed deep below. And then, nothing. No wreckage, no men, no surfacing hull. Just the sea flattening back into silence. For most of the war, this is the point where the U-boat has probably lived. It has taken the hit, endured the terror, and slipped away beneath the explosions. But by the spring of the Atlantic War's turning point, that silence could mean something else entirely. The visible attack was over. The real danger had only just begun. That is the mystery that hung over the ocean in 1943. Why were submarines being destroyed after they had already done the one thing they were supposed to do? The crash dive was not a desperate improvisation. It was doctrine, reflex, survival itself. A U-boat on the surface was vulnerable, but a U-boat that could get under quickly became an elusive target in a three-dimensional world. Aircraft could spot, strafe, and force a dive, but once the boat disappeared, the attacker was suddenly guessing. Depth charges had to be dropped where the submarine had been moments before, at a depth chosen before anyone could know exactly where the boat had turned or how steeply it had gone down. And depth charges were brutally imprecise weapons. A U-boat's pressure hull could survive anything short of a very close blast. Many boats endured attack after attack, sometimes hundreds of charges over long hunts, and still crawled away. So return to that opening moment and stay with it a little longer. The aircraft has passed over. The depth charges have already detonated. Inside the submarine, the crew is listening for the next pattern, the next crushing shock, the sound that tells them the attackers still know where they are. But suppose the next pattern never comes. Suppose instead there is only the hum of motors, the groan of the hull, men working trim, the captain ordering more depth, more angle, more speed to get clear. Everything about that maneuver says escape. Everything about it had been trained into them as escape. And yet those same sounds, the very sounds of survival, were becoming a beacon. The question was no longer where the submarine had been when the bombs fell. The question was what could find it after it vanished. The answer did not arrive as some dramatic, giant new battleship gun or some visible machine mounted under an aircraft wing. It came in the form of a weapon so secret it was disguised, even in its own paperwork. The Americans called it the Mark 24 mine, partly to move it through bureaucracy, and partly to conceal what it really was, an airdropped acoustic homing torpedo. Those words matter less than the tactical idea behind them. Scientists and naval officers understood the same frustrating truth every anti-submarine crew had learned the hard way. Once a submarine submerged, the depth charge became a wager. So they designed a weapon that would not explode at a guessed point in the ocean. It would go into the water alive to the hunt, begin searching on its own, and listen for the one thing a diving submarine could not avoid making: propeller noise. After launch, the aircraft no longer had to solve the whole attack in a single pass. It only had to put a listener into the water near the target. And almost as soon as it entered service, the Atlantic began producing encounters that no longer fit the old logic. On the 12th of May, a British Liberator struck U-456 with one of these new homing torpedoes. The boat was left crippled on the surface. When the destroyer HMS Opportune closed in, Captain Max Teichert chose the move that U-boat captains had chosen again and again when the surface became impossible: dive. It was the instinct of a survivor. It may also have been the boat's final mistake. According to the later reconstruction, U-456 went under to avoid capture and never came back, almost certainly sinking at once with all hands. This is the crucial emotional shift in the story. A crash dive used to mean that, however bad things were, there was still a path downward. Now the descent itself could be the road to destruction. That happened in the same terrible month the German submarine arm would remember as disaster. May of 1943 broke the momentum of the U-boat campaign. More than 40 boats were lost in that single month, and the Germans never truly recovered. Air power was central to the reversal. Patrol aircraft no longer simply disrupted attacks or forced submarines down for escorts to worry about later. They were becoming killers in their own right, closing the old escape hatch one invention at a time. Radar found the boats. Longer-range aircraft reached the once safer gaps. Escort carriers pushed air cover farther out. New doctrine grew more aggressive. And among these changes sat a small, secret weapon that attacked the one moment German crews still trusted most. By the end of May, the Atlantic had begun to feel different. The U-boats had not forgotten how to dive. It was worse than that. Diving was starting to betray them. Now come back again to the attack sequence, because this is where the trap becomes clear. The torpedo enters the water after the submarine has vanished. It does not rush straight ahead like a conventional torpedo fired at a visible ship. It settles to its set depth and begins circling, patient, almost methodical. In its nose are hydrophones, underwater ears. If they hear nothing strong enough, it keeps searching. If they catch the beat of screws somewhere in the dark water, the weapon turns toward the louder signal. It does not need to know the submarine's exact depth from the start. It does not need the aircraft to keep seeing the target. It follows sound. And a crash-diving boat is full of sound. Electric motors working hard, propellers biting, hull angles changing, ballast tanks flooding. The whole machine in violent transition from exposed surface craft to hidden underwater predator. What had once made the dive effective against depth charges now gave the new torpedo something to home on. This is why the confusion around these losses matters so much. From the German side, the destruction could feel delayed, almost disconnected from the visible attack. The aircraft had attacked, yes. The depth charges had exploded, yes. But if the boat was then struck, after the pattern had ended, what exactly had happened? Even Allied records were not always clear in the moment. Some sinkings were first credited to depth charges and only later reassessed. In other words, the chaos of anti-submarine combat could hide the true mechanism of death from both hunter and hunted. For the men below, the sequence must have been especially unnerving. They knew what depth charges sounded like. They knew the rhythm of a surface chase. What they were facing now could arrive after the expected climax, when the attack should have been fading. The visible violence above became only the opening act. The killing blow came from below, quiet until the instant it did not. Months later, another Atlantic fight showed the same logic with almost clinical clarity. In December, during the long destruction of Yuan 72, an Avenger pilot from an American hunter-killer group selected a FIDO attack as the submarine crash-dived. He released the torpedo only seconds after the boat disappeared beneath the surface. About a minute later, the crew in the aircraft saw the sea answer with a shockwave and a circular bubble pattern ahead of the diving swirl. That image is important because it captures the new timing of the hunt. The weapon was not trying to beat the submarine to the dive. It was meeting the submarine inside the dive, exploiting the seconds after disappearance when a U-boat captain would once have believed the odds were finally swinging back in his favor. The aircraft no longer had to finish the story before the water closed over the hull. It could begin the last chapter afterward. And that changed the psychology of the Atlantic War as much as the statistics. Before, an air sighting was a race against the hatch. If the boat could get under in time, the attacker might force it deep, shake it, maybe damage it, but often not destroy it outright. After FIDO, the crash dive became a choice between two kinds of danger. Stay up too long and the aircraft would kill you in the open. Go down fast, and you might hand a homing weapon the exact acoustic trail it needed. The old movement of submarine combat had been inverted. The captain's most reliable answer to sudden exposure was now entangled with the hunter's newest advantage. That is why this was not merely a technical improvement. It was a tactical reversal, and, for the crews living it, a deeply unsettling one. The Atlantic had taught them that safety lay below the surface. Suddenly, below the surface was where the unseen pursuer was waiting. The wider battle of the Atlantic turned on many things at once, and no single weapon won it alone. Intelligence, radar, escort carriers, better tactics, support groups, more aircraft, and the sheer industrial weight of the Allies all mattered. But some inventions change a battle not because they are the biggest, but because they shatter a habit the enemy depends on. Fido did that. It attacked a confidence. It reached into the narrow window between sighting and disappearance, and kept the attack alive after the visible part was over. That mattered in a campaign where seconds decided whether a convoy ship burned on the surface or a submarine slipped away to strike again the next night. By the time the Germans were reeling from the catastrophic losses of spring, the ocean itself had become less forgiving. It was no longer enough for a U-boat to vanish well. Now it also had to vanish quietly, instantly, almost impossibly. So hear the opening scene one last time. The lookout shouts, the aircraft dives, the U-boat crash dives. Depth charges fall. The sea erupts. The explosions fade. Inside the boat, perhaps for a few seconds, there is relief. They made it under. They broke the line of sight. They survived the attack everyone could see. But somewhere in that same water, a slower, quieter hunter is now circling on its own. It is not chasing the splash. It is listening for the screws. The captain orders more depth. The motors answer. And with every turn of the propellers, the submarine is telling the weapon exactly where to go. That was the trap. The crash dive had not failed because German crews forgot how to survive. It failed because survival itself had started making the right noise.